All right, thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. Now, I'm going to share my screen to get going here. Are your city's monuments worthy? Take the quiz. I'm going to walk you through a blueprint to be able to address controversial historic site and monument issues and questions that come up, which has been top of mind in recent years. And my story begins at the Martin Luther King home, where Wendy just mentioned I used to work, and I was standing on that porch that you're looking at. This is the home of Martin Luther King as a child when he was all the way from birth to age 12. And I was about to walk into the house, guiding a tour of a group of kids who clearly had been beaten up. They had scars on their skull, lashes on the back of their neck, age between 9 and 13, with a chaperone. And I asked the chaperone about the kids, about where they were coming from and what their story was. And what I discovered is that they were slaves. This is in the year 2010. And I was meeting slaves born at around the year 2000. They had escaped from the illegal human trafficking trade from Haiti and had come to Atlanta, Georgia through this program. And among their first stops that they wanted to see was the home of Martin Luther King. Why? Because of the power and the legacy of Martin Luther King and the power of the place of a historic site. My journey had come full circle. I had started as a park ranger at Gettysburg and other Civil War battlefields around Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital of, during the Civil War. And at Gettysburg and the Confederate capital battles that surround Richmond, Virginia, I had sort of learned how to engage with different perspectives, different ways to engage with the battlefield, monumentation, but also very importantly, why we were there in the first place. You don't have a civil war if you don't have a national dispute over the issue of slavery. A century prior to the events that made Martin Luther King famous. And during my time at the battlefield, I learned from a supervisor as a young person that was coming up, the story of two camps. Often in the Civil War, what you find in interpretation is someone is in love with a certain general or in love with a certain ideology or hates a certain general. And the problem, as my supervisor said, is that people get into these camps and that prevents their ability to understand the complexities of the Battle of Gettysburg and the war. And the reason I use this picture that reminds me of that story is because of the big guns, the cannon. It's as if we enter the interpretation, ready with the big guns to blow down the people that are in front of us that oppose us. That story of the two camps really stuck with me forever, such that I realized that in order to understand a place, a person, historical events, you had to step beyond the camps and not try to validate the camp that you're in, but be open to the nuances of the circumstance. Years later, I found myself on television in 2020 with, of course, the monument controversies that flared up. As you can see, on the left side was a monument issue in Virginia, where we had a lot of Confederate monumentation. And on the right side, a little bit different than what makes most of the national media, we had a monument issue in New Mexico, where I used to live. And I love the headline there, a monumental question. And that was one between the indigenous groups of New Mexico and the colonial legacy with the Spanish conquistadors. And we're going to get into that a little bit as we progress throughout the talk, even in the state of Vermont. So coming full circle then, to that moment in 2010, on the porch of the Martin Luther King home, I had been through a century of that history, from the Civil War, North and South, and now from Civil War to civil rights. And I understood the power of place, the emotions it can elicit. And in that process, I pulled together my 4 questions for the blueprint. So when I take you through this journey here is the attitude I would like you to have when approaching. One, I hope to surprise your perception. When you look through these content that I'm going to share, and in the future after me, I want you to look to not just validate your perception the way that the camps do in the Civil War, but rather to surprise your perception. Because then you know that history doesn't always fit into what you already believe. I often say, whatever you think, history disagrees. Because history is such a vast tapestry that it doesn't fit into a neat ideology, doesn't fit into a neat belief. It's complex. There's so many different people and perspectives and interpretations. So look to surprise your perception to add new ones. As a result, leading to step 2, to provoke reflection. That is, to provoke yourself to reflect, muse, curiosity, that maybe what I always thought to be true isn't quite always true, that it's not an absolute. There are gray areas and layers. And finally, therefore, to inspire learning. Because now that you are in that position of reflecting, now you know that there's more to learn. And in our time together, I'm going to be able to plant a seed, but not the entire tree. There's so much more than what we can cover on today or any other issue that you learn. It's to continue to learn with these different layers. So what's the blueprint? The first question of the 4 questions to ask when you're encountering a difficult historic site is why remember? This is a question of significance. Why is it significant? Let's start there before we debate what happens, who's right and who's wrong. Let's start with the significance. Significance doesn't always have to be national, international. It could be local. It could be to a family. For example, right here in Vermont, St. Albans Raid. Some of you may have heard of it. As you can see there on the left, a historic marker, and on the right, a plaque that's on a building. They're put up by different groups and have a little bit different take on it, but what St. Albans Raid is, later in the war in 1864, you have an attempt by a small Confederate group to go up to Canada and come down into Vermont as a raid to put pressure away from the southern, from further south. Because if you look at the context of what's going on in the Civil War at that point, there's a lot of pressure from the Union Army on Virginia. So they're hoping to divert some attention and soldiers there to relieve some pressure around Richmond, the Confederate capital. In doing so, this becomes, at least some claim, the northernmost action of the Civil War, although multiple places claim that, so depends how you look at it. So the question here is, why remember? What's the significance? Is the fact that it's the northernmost action, or at least one of the claims to it, the significance? Or is it because there's larger context of what's going on further south and trying to relieve pressure from there? What I think is interesting, the plaque on the right refers to stirring incidents that happened during an adventure in the Civil War. So different ways to look at the significance, but it certainly is significant to the local community. Doesn't always have to be a big national narrative, but sometimes it is. How about the atomic bomb? Now I'm curious, in the chat, why is this significant? Since we're talking about why remember the atomic bomb, the mushroom cloud? You all can put a few words in the chat. You're welcome to. I'm curious what you guys think. It could be just one word. Japan, devastation. It changed everything. Tech breakthrough. Future avoidance, or the deterrence argument. That's one you come to prevent from happening again. So we can go on, but you see, the significance of why remember to me is in part because of all these things. Whether you like the bomb or not, the significance question is looking at the impact and influence of that event or person or symbol or whatever we're looking at on the subject matter, whether it's a national community, a local community, or international, which certainly you can argue the atomic bomb internationally. How about more recently? Why remember? Significance can change. For example, the history between Russia and Ukraine, or at least the region. The nations aren't always organized the way that they are today, of course. You see, more than 10 years ago, I took a graduate course on the Russian steppe region, which, of course, Ukraine includes the Russian steppe region. Didn't seem all that significant then, but years later, when these events flared up between Russia and Ukraine, and of course continue today, suddenly it seems significant. So the significance question can take different forms. Or, in a more fun attitude, how about the significance of civility? Here I am doing a TV segment on George Washington and asking, are you following George Washington's rules for civility on the 4th of July? He has 100+ rules for civility that you can easily find online that he put out as a young man. And I thought on the 4th of July, and certainly in the environment around history and historic sites and historical narratives that we combat and fight over, I thought civility was a relevant topic. And it was significant as a concept. And I thought to deliver it in a fun way, because what I'm doing in these images on television is certainly the opposite of what he advocated in his rules for civility. So the significance can take many different forms, as we can see, and depends on the situation at hand. So question number 2 to ask about the contested historic sites. What is the history being remembered? So after we have established the significance of a place or a person or event in any one of the ways I explained before or other ways, now we have to consider what are some of the factual things that we can agree to that actually happened here. This is again different than whether I like it or not. We're looking first at significance, and second, what actually is being remembered here. So going back to Vermont, well, in this case, at the battlefield at Gettysburg, one of the sites I worked, what you're seeing is a monument by the state of Vermont to the Vermont soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg, which for those of you who may not know, it's right in the middle of the Civil War in 1863, about halfway through. With hindsight, we know it's halfway through. Of course, they don't know that at the time. And you have one of the turning points of the war. It's not the only one, but certainly to this day is the largest and bloodiest battle in all of American history. We have more than 50,000 casualties in 3 days. Vermont soldiers, who, by the way, have multiple monuments throughout the park, which has about 1,300 monuments and markers throughout the national park there. So it's a huge 6,000-acre battlefield. You're talking about 170,000 people that fought there. So sometimes, people have this notion that it's like a football field. No, it's not. It's a lot more, a lot larger. And some of the Vermont monuments are to particular units that fought there. But this is by the state to Vermonters in general. Part of the reason for that is because Vermont plays a significant role at the Battle of Gettysburg. At the top there is George Stannard. He was different ranks at different points in the war. He's a colonel over here just before he's going to go on to be a general officer. And his men do a key maneuver on the 3rd day of the battle to repulse the famous Pickett's Charge, which is a Confederate Southern frontal assault against a Union position on day 3, which ends up in a disaster and ends the Battle of Gettysburg. So what is the history to be remembered here through the monument? Well, one thing I find funny, if you dig a little bit deeper, look on the right side where we have the zoom in of the statue on top of the monument. And that field there is the fields of Pickett's Charge. His right arm is missing. Now, George Stannard was wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was wounded 2 more times toward the end of the war, once at Cold Harbor and also at Fort Harrison. Both sites I also worked at outside of Richmond. So all 3 places that he got wounded, I worked on those battlefields. So I guess I carried bad luck for George Stannard, even though I came 150 years later. But what's interesting is that he actually didn't lose his right arm at Gettysburg. He lost his right arm later in the war, in some future wound. So in some ways, this particular depiction of the hero of Vermont at the Battle of Gettysburg is inaccurate. Monumentation, as we will see as we go along is not always the same thing as a historical account. So you may see his missing right arm and in hindsight, kind of project and assume that he was missing his arm at Gettysburg or because of Gettysburg, but that's actually not true. It does, however, commemorate what Vermonters did at the Battle of Gettysburg, which is what I described. How about here in New Mexico, in the Southwest, looking at petroglyphs, as they're known, which is etchings on the rocks that span centuries, they're not all done at one time, by the indigenous peoples of New Mexico, the ancestors of Pueblos and others. I'm curious for this one, when we ask the question, what is the history to be remembered? What do you see? If you want to put a word in the chat, I'd like to see what you see. What do you think is a history to be remembered here? There is no right answer, so you can toss in whatever word comes to mind. Tribal history, the land's original inhabitants, culture, indigenous. Yeah, what I find interesting when we ask, there's so many different directions we can go here. Art. It's like, what is the history to be remembered here? The reality is we don't really know exactly the history here, so it's easy to project anything on that. Nice sunsets. Yeah, certainly New Mexico has that. Early civilization. Yeah, a lot of times you hear people respect. That's another one in the chat. A lot of times you hear people, talk about this is what the rock art means. But the reality is we don't really know. That's their projection and interpretation. Most recent of these are a few centuries old, and some go back a couple thousand years. There's the particular mesa or plateau that I was at when I took these photos has 10,000, at least 10,000 that we know of, that we have seen and counted, just that one plateau of these images. So that tells you that across the generations, they meant different things. It's not even like, we can't condense time and say that someone writing 1,500 years ago meant the same thing as someone writing 500 years ago. So we have to be careful, right? We have to be careful. Certainly I like to respect it and remember it and protect it. But that doesn't mean when we answer the question of what is the history to be remembered here, that we have a definitive answer, because different people meant different things. And when someone tries to tell you definitively that this is what it means, they're projecting their own meanings. You got to be careful with that when you're trying to ask yourself, what is the history to be remembered? How about here? Let's go back to the East Coast and in the colonial era on the left side, both of these actually in Virginia, but on the left side, a monument to John Smith at Jamestown, Virginia, in the early 17th century is when Jamestown became the first permanent English colony in the North American mainland. John Smith certainly has all kinds of stories and myths and narratives and legends around him. But what I find interesting is when we're talking about what is a history to be remembered, is we have to try to unpack all that, to try to understand what happened in Jamestown, Virginia, which you can argue, some people, is perhaps the origin of the United States as we know it, although I would take some, I would challenge that a little bit, because I think we're reading backwards. In 1607, nobody knows that there's a United States coming. And so I think the United States is much more continental. However, in a lot of our imagination and our narratives that we tell ourselves, part of the reason that Jamestown is so significant is because we think of it as one of the origin stories of the United States. On the right side, also in Virginia, but a different era, a couple hundred years later, Robert E. Lee, a monument on Monument Avenue, as it's known, in Richmond, Virginia, to a series of Confederate leaders, and Arthur Ashe, who was added later, a Black tennis player from Richmond, Virginia. As you know, Monument Avenue was kind of under hot debate a couple years ago, and eventually the monuments were removed. So that's my photo when it was still up years prior with Robert E. Lee on Monument Avenue. So you have to ask yourself, what is the history to be remembered? In that case of the monument, it's not like Lee was ever actually at that spot. the history of Robert E. Lee is a little bit different than exactly what's on that monument. Staying on Monument Avenue, on the left side, is a monument to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Jeff Davis was the president of the Confederacy. That's very different than what's on the right side, the White House of the Confederacy, also in Richmond, Virginia. Now, this is a place where we could see the history and the historic site versus the monument. Something that I find people often get mixed up, and this is going to come in very relevant when we get further along in this talk. You see, on the left side, Jeff Davis was never on that platform. He was never where that monument was, or at least if he was nothing significant. Might have walked by there, but there's nothing that happened associated with Jeff Davis there. The monument is by an artist, a couple generations later, depicting their portrayal of a certain image of Jeff Davis. It's an artistic work. On the right side is a historic site, the place where many key things happen, decisions happen for the Civil War or during the Civil War, because it was the counter to the White House in DC, where Abraham Lincoln was hanging out, not terribly far away from Richmond. So you see, the monument is not necessarily the same thing as a historic site. The historic site is the place where whatever the topic is happened. The Battle of Gettysburg, there's one Battle of Gettysburg. There's one Battle of Antietam. There's one of St. Albans Raid. The places where these things happen are the historic sites. The power of place, Martin Luther King's home, with the kids that I was with. That's different than, let's say, a monument to Martin Luther King that so many different cities have. That may or may not even be somewhere he visited, or if he did visit there, the city, probably not where the location of the monument is, or even street names to Martin Luther King that we do to commemorate and remember him. But that's not necessarily the historic site where certain events took place. So what we have to remember when we're looking at these things, and we're asking what is the history to be remembered, at a historic site where the place and the thing actually occurred, there's a different set of questions to ask about what happened, versus at a monument where there may be a disconnect between the piece of art and what the history really is, if it even pertains to that specific location. So then we move on to the third question. After we've established the significance in question one, after we establish what are we actually trying to remember, the factual information in question two, now we ask, well, what does it mean to remember? Because just by the very act of selecting to remember certain events, people, and things and symbols, you're taking some sort of action and have to ask yourself what that meaning is. For example, in the case of Vermont, you have a bunch of these monuments that exist, as many other places, throughout communities, local towns throughout the state. Many states have that. What I find funny, though, is elements of what you're seeing in front of you were mass produced at a certain point. So they could be mix and match because there were so many of these town and community monuments being put up. Now, as far as our question goes, what does it mean to remember? We have to ask ourselves a couple of things. Let's go down the path with Vermont, for example. There's 2 rounds of monumentation in Vermont. One is during the war. You see, in the middle of the war, when there's a lot of loss occurring, much like Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address to try to, at the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, to try to, refocus and continue the war effort and to provide morale support. The state of Vermont enabled towns to put up monuments to their soldiers because they were experiencing so much loss. That's a different meaning than what happens about a generation later. The Civil War veterans, while they were pretty active, for example, you might have heard of the Grand Army of the Republic. That was a Civil War Union Army veteran organization. And occasionally they have a monument in various places in the country. They were not big monument builders. It was actually the next generation that, in looking back, started to put up monuments. And in different states, for different reasons, you start an era for that from between the 1890s to the 1920s, where there's tremendous sort of springing up of different monuments. Vermont participates in that as well. Again, not necessarily by the veterans themselves, but because there is that market, you start to get some mass-produced pieces that start to come together for your generic monuments that are in these communities. There's a few different designs that tend to pop up. You may not always have it that way. Certainly for gigantic, big, significant monuments, that may not be the case, like the Vermont Monument in Gettysburg at the battlefield. That's not a mass-produced one. But for a local town that doesn't want to spend a lot of money, this can make a lot of sense to commemorate its men that fought in the Civil War. But what does it mean to remember? Think about it. It meant something different during the war than it did a generation later. And even a generation later, it meant something different for the veterans versus their kids who saw it differently. We wanted to commemorate their parents and later their grandparents. And that's the kind of thing you have to look at as the context of what's going on. Let's go into symbols. Confederate flag, one of my favorite symbols in terms of the questions that we can ask around it. On the right side is me as a park ranger doing a talk with that very same flag that you see as an image about the uses of the Confederate flag since the Civil War. So let's look at the different ways the Confederate flag was used. Here is one right here, the Confederate flag from the war itself. This is an artifact. It really is a museum artifact. This flag on the left side went through the war. You see, the reason you see the battles on there is because a unit, in this case, the 48th Virginia, you may see in the center there, you see 48 VA. A unit, as they went through the battles, they would stitch on there the battles that that flag had been through. That's a singular artifact. That's different than, for example, something you buy at the store that has a symbol, but has not actually been through battle. But the use of the Confederate flag changed over time. One of the things people often forget is it's not just how it's originally used, but it's how generations later use it. Much like the monuments, we do the same with symbols. Part of the history of the Confederate flag after the Civil War, in the generations since, was by people in the 1930s to the 1960s who invoked what they thought was a Confederate heritage to stand for the white supremacy. On the left side, you have someone campaigning for George Wallace, the famous Alabama governor who gave the speech, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And he stood intentionally at the former capital of the Confederacy, the first capital in Montgomery, Alabama, before he moved to Richmond, and specifically cited that Confederate heritage as the reason he was standing there giving that speech. And on the right side, of course, you have the Klan, using not just the Confederate flag, but also the American flag and the cross, three symbols that they often put together. It's not just the Confederate flag that was there, but others as well. But how about the use of the Confederate flag here? This is more from the 80s and 90s. You have a water park on the right side in Florida. You have in the center General Lee, the Dodge Challenger, or the Charger, excuse me, the Dodge Charger that was used in the film. And on the left side, just again, used in pop culture. These are all very different uses of the Confederate flag. When someone tells you that the Confederate flag has a history that you can't change, my question is, which history? Because there are different layers to this. So when someone is dealing with a historical symbol, whether it's this flag or something else, my question is, what does it mean to remember? And given some of the loaded history, if you do use it, what does it mean to use this? As you know, in recent years, in the past 10 years, that has started, the tide has started to change such that what does it mean to remember, even if it was used in a different context, people started to look and second guess that and say, well, maybe we shouldn't be putting it up that way. So these memories are changing also. There isn't one static way. Let's go back to the atomic bomb. What does it mean to remember? There's a photo of the gadget as it was known. when they were building and working on the atomic bomb and eventually the test site in New Mexico. In this case, I think of scientific achievement. But when I look at this one in Japan, what does it mean to remember changes. It changes to one of destruction, which we saw one of the words earlier in the chat. It changes to one of tragedy or war. But when I look here at the victory and the surrender of the Japanese in World War II because of the atomic bomb, again, what does it mean to remember changes? It means victory, relief, and all the things that we think of after World War II, of course, defeating various elements of fascism and genocide, etc. So what does it mean to remember depends on what you're looking at and how you're looking at it. And the thing to remember with what does it mean to remember, to me also, and then when it comes to the Manhattan Project, which is the project that led to the creation of the atomic bomb. And the reason I wrote one of my books on it is because when the Manhattan Project National Historical Park was proposed in Congress in 2012 as a national park, to be created as a national park, it failed. Did not go through. It would eventually go through 2 years later. But one of the reasons that it failed was because there was this question of, what does it mean to remember if we create a national park to the creation of the atomic bomb? Are we glorifying it? Are we commemorating? Are we celebrating? Are we condemning? What are we doing? Now, national parks aren't always happy places. I think of Manzanar, for example, a place of Japanese internment, or Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. So I think you could have a national park to a place that some people like, some people don't, for different reasons. But when I go back to these questions, the significance part, what happened here part, and what does it mean to remember it, I got to handle that what does it mean to remember very carefully, knowing that these different perspectives exist. So let's go locally in Vermont and take a look at a question like this that I think is a great case study to show us what I'm just talking about. So you have a monument in Vermont at Champlain College to Samuel de Champlain, who, for those of you who may not know, in the late 16th and early 17th century, is a French explorer who comes into what we would now see as the northeastern US and kind of southeast Canada, has a lot of dealings with indigenous peoples, does some mapping, exploration, gets into some battles, creates some alliances, all kinds of stories around him. He's a very famous figure, and Champlain College is in Burlington, Vermont. And there's a monument that actually was put up relatively recently to Samuel Champlain, but that caused some kind of controversy or issue, debate around it a few years ago. So what I did was I lifted from a local student newspaper a few quotes that I thought represent often what we hear around various monuments and the types of things that come up that relate to what does it mean to remember, which is why we fight over these monuments. There's the only place I use text. I'm not a big fan of text unless I'm trying to show you directly the voices of the people involved. But take a look at the top one, location. Location matters. I don't want it in a museum. I don't want it next door. I want it gone. So in other words, they care about where it is. Person. My reading of the statue is that it represents racism, colonialism, America. In other words, he's reading into it who Champlain is as a person. Depiction, which is how is the monument depicting the person? While Samuel de Champlain did overall contribute to colonialism, that's not what the statue represents in their perspective. He's holding a telescope. It represents his relationship with the Abenaki, which is a local indigenous group. How about history? You hear this one a lot. You can't erase history. When you erase history, then people forget about it. Be careful how you approach this. If you're going to be an activist, be a responsible activist. Do you know who that last line came from? The leader of the Abenaki at the time. I think we'd be surprised to see that. Not who you expect that line to come from. So when you're talking about Samuel de Champlain, the monument to me captures the different things that people bring up. Are we erasing history? We hear that term all the time. Is it about the person? Is it about the specific thing that is depicting? Is it about where it's placed, on public ground versus a museum? These are the questions that help answer what does it mean to remember. And finally, how remember? We've gone through all this. Now we have to remember, how do we tell these stories? And how do we remember, meaning how do we capture all these different layers? So going back up to St. Albans, there is a memorial to the Civil War soldiers, a little bit different than what we saw earlier, not to the raid that took place there, but to the Civil War soldiers that fought from there. There were many that came out of there. In fact, George Standard himself was in St. Albans at some point before he was in the Civil War. He worked there. And the text you see on there is really just Lincoln's Gettysburg Address transcribed on there. So gives you an idea of how his address was, of course, universally seen as, proper dedication, commemoration to the soldiers. So are these town commemorative places a way to remember? Or speaking of Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, how about national cemeteries? This is the Gettysburg National Cemetery. And on the left side there are unknown soldiers. They don't have names. That's why their graves are so small, or the stones are so small, because they're numbered. There's 900 some odd, almost 1,000 that are unidentified soldiers buried there from the battle. The ultimate sacrifice, I think, when you give up your identity and who you are. And how about, of course, the event at the National Cemetery? Is that a way to remember? Or how about Ethan Allen? Speaking of cemeteries, he has a monument at his gravesite in Vermont. But when you talk about the story of Ethan Allen, it's really fascinating because he is in part a revolutionary hero because of what he did to take back Fort Ticonderoga, one of the big moments in the American Revolution, on behalf of the Americans. But on the other hand, he also was someone that was part of controversial negotiations a few years later, the later part of the revolution, because there's Vermont, not yet a state at the time. That territory was disputed between New York and New Hampshire. And basically, Ethan Allen got into some discussions with the British to try to be an independent British province. And that did not sit well with Americans. So there's all these different perspectives of how to remember. How do you tell the story of Ethan Allen? Another way to remember at the sites, sometimes they do reenactments or depictions like this, or living history as it's known. Now, I think there are varying degrees of accuracy to these things, some better than others, but it is one of the ways that people tell stories and can experience maybe the gunpowder, which matters because I don't care how loud you think guns are, you have not heard them as loud as you would at a Civil War site. And even these guys, when they do a reenactment, they use a fraction of the gunpowder that we used in real battle. And that gives you a sense of why the soldiers often in battle were terrified, lost, confused, and made very bad decisions. Because sometimes as an armchair general looking back, you ask, well, why did they do this? And why did they do that? That was so stupid. Until you sit through that, then you understand. Another way to remember is tours, to actually visit the sites. There's me in my glory days taking around a big group at the battlefield at Gettysburg. And on that battlefield, another way to remember is the buildings. It's not just a field. There is the Bryan House. He was a widower and he had some kids. He was a free Black man in southern Pennsylvania, just north of the Mason-Dixon line, which of course, south of the Mason-Dixon line, you had slavery that was legal. And during the Civil War, the Southern Army, as they were invading Pennsylvania, had the authority from the Confederate law to capture anyone who was Black and be considered slave. This guy didn't want to lose his freedom. So when the Confederate Army was in the vicinity, he took off. He abandoned his home and he came back after the battle. And like many farms around it, it was destroyed. So you can tell the stories, the buildings. Or how about this building in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the atomic bomb was created? But prior to the atomic bomb, it was also a building for the Los Alamos Boys Ranch School, where the elite of the East Coast sent their school kids in the 1900s to the early 1940s to do a boarding school that also had a Western kind of Boy Scouts type of feel, along with an elite liberal arts education before they went to Ivy Leagues. On the left side in black and white is one of those graduations, one of the last classes before the Manhattan Project came to town and kicked them out. And on the right side is a recent community event. I used to work in that building when I worked at the History Museum there because we had some activities in that building, but weddings take place there, dance parties take place there, lectures take place there. Is that a way to remember maintaining a community building still as a community building? Another way to have the stories and maintain its original use, but in different ways, adapting to what is currently needed. Or how about monuments that are actually on the site of the units? So I mentioned a lot of monuments are not actually on their actual sites, but there are exceptions like anything else. So it's very complicated. These are examples of monuments that are on the sites where units actually fought at Gettysburg on the site itself. Are these monuments any better or worse than the others? How do you tell these stories? How do you remember? Or a memorial. We talked about the memorial in St. Albans, but how about this one? This is the Pennsylvania State Memorial on the same battlefield, very close to the Vermont one. But what I find a little bit different about this one is you see what that man is looking at is the names of the Pennsylvania soldiers that fought in the Battle of Gettysburg. So remembering them by name reminds me a little bit of the Vietnam Memorial in DC. And as we close up here, my last example is how about what we do as a nation? What you see there on television is the quarters, the American Women's Quarters Program that was put out by the US men starting last year and will continue the next 3 years with a different set of women each year, historic women put on the other side of George Washington to remember, to bring attention to historic women that often are not discussed enough in history. One of those women is Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou on the right side, on the tail side, George Washington on the left side, on the head side. The reason I like this so much for our talk is because it's important to remember that there can be two sides to the coin, that there can be really more than two sides, but the coin is two-dimensional, or it has two sides, but they can have space for both George Washington's story and Maya Angelou's story. In many ways, you could argue that either one wouldn't exist without the other. And so the way we have to kind of think about this, I think, when we're talking about how to remember is the many layers, the many sides, literally, the physically in your hand, you can have the quarter and remember that there is multiple sides and many layers when you're talking about how to remember. And that brings me to my favorite historical figure, which is a story that I'll close with. As we open with the Martin Luther King story, we close going back to the colonial era. On the left side is George Wythe. He tutored both John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson, who are both on the right side. John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson went on to achieve great things in early American political history. Jefferson, of course, wrote the Declaration, did other things, and of course, eventually served as President of the United States. John Marshall, among other things, served as the first strong Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And those two battled each other. Jefferson hated Marshall, and Marshall hated Jefferson. But they were both taught by the same guy, George Wythe. And the reason I like that so much is because it shows you that when you're a good teacher, you don't indoctrinate to think just like you, but you give them the skills to go on to grow for themselves. That each of these men, both Jefferson and Marshall, both very smart, both very accomplished, can believe opposite things, even though they had the same teacher. And that's something I respect about Wythe. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, when you look at the 7 men that signed for Virginia, the last person to sign was George Wythe, but he signs at the top because the Virginians left the top open for him to sign at top because of the respect they had for George Wythe, who tutored so many of them, some of whom went on to be rivals. So if you'd like to see more, these are the ways you can check me out and contact me to get in touch. Check out my website, check out classes I offer, TV segments I do, other talks I've done, and my YouTube channel on the left side and lower left there with my username. Thanks for tuning in to walk through this, and I welcome any questions that you all have through the chat.
Hi, thanks, Raffi. This is Ryan. I have a question or two for you while people are typing, formulating their own questions. I think my first question, if you'd be willing to speak a little bit about the role of Civil War statues in the South as part of the creation of the Lost Cause mythology, and when that happened in relation to when some of the Grand Army of the Republic statues, the Union statues, started appearing up in Vermont and other northern states.
Yeah, so it depends. I mean, of course, it depends on each individual case, right? But they do start around the same time, a generation later and beyond. But I think the nature of the monuments in the 1890s is a little bit different than the nature of the monuments in the 1920s. But it's usually the later generations that are looking back and putting up the monumentation. Now, in the South, sometimes it's associated with Jim Crow, depending on when you're talking about it. It's not always, sometimes associated with Jim Crow, but the Lost Cause mythology that you're talking about is one that says that our cause was just, but we just didn't get the outcome we wanted. The classic example of the Lost Cause is Gone with the Wind, the most successful film in all of American history. That's a lost cause depiction. And the cause also that they talk about often is more so focused on independence and trying to, create their own country, but it leaves out why they wanted to start their own country, which of course is to protect the institution of slavery. And sometimes people cite Confederate sources that say, oh, I'm not, that wasn't why the war was. But usually those sources are years after the war, when slavery had fallen out of vogue in the world. So they didn't want to be depicted as fighting for something that was passé. But if you look during the war, there's absolutely no question. When the states leave the Union, they say, this is why we're leaving the Union, and they specifically cite slavery. So what Lost Cause does is it kind of takes pieces of this stuff and tries to depict this grand and noble cause. And that's why I will say, even at the Battle of Gettysburg, you can see the monuments that are not put up by veterans that go up later, they definitely have more of that lost cause-y type language. It's very flowery, very noble, but incomplete.
Thank you. And I'll just call to see if others have questions that they'd like to type into the chat or into the Q&A. I do have another one. Maybe I'll ask you to speculate, not so much to look back, but maybe to look ahead a little bit. I'm curious what you think about, memorials that we've seen or might see for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
Oh man, you're killing me, because I hate to look into the future and guess.
I know I've had sometimes interviewed historians who just will refuse to do that. So I know. I guess the first question is: have we already started to see memorials for, Desert Storm or the Afghanistan conflict?
I think one of the ways we do that, Ryan, is we focus on the soldiers, not the larger causes, right? And I think that happens in the Civil War too. Like, for example, just because the Confederacy was fighting to defend slavery doesn't mean every individual soldier was. Individual soldiers have different reasons for fighting. And the same thing applies here. So we try to sometimes separate that. We do that a little bit with Vietnam too. In the early years after Vietnam, there isn't a lot of memorialization going on. But in the generation or two since, we start to kind of say, oh, we need to redeem the memory of the Vietnam soldiers who fought and sacrificed. So my speculation would be something along those lines, focusing more on the soldiers and the sacrifices they made independent of the cause, since that has fallen out of fashion. I would leave the door open, though, to say that if something happens in the future that makes what we connect to those wars feel relevant again, we may dig up that memory and turn it into a positive. So it just depends on what's going on in the present. Usually when we depict the past through a memory type thing, it says more about what we have in the present than it does about the past, because we're trying to look to the past to validate our position, going back to the camps thing. Another example of that is Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson, right? Jefferson used to be the thing until the Sally Hemings things came out. And then now Hamilton is a thing, in part influenced by the musical and pop culture. So these things ebb and flow and change. So I leave room for that to change, even though right now it's harder to see that with the nation kind of distancing itself from those wars.
And I see there are a couple questions in the chat and also in Q&A. And
Cool.
Wendy, I don't know if you want to read those, or Raffi, if you can
I
see.
see it. I see. Yeah, I see one that says from Marcus, says, what advice would you give to individuals when they approach looking at history with balancing our own subjective perspectives and dealing with cognitive dissonance in our own head? Certainly there are ways to carry two thoughts at once. There are ways to carry two thoughts at once. And in fact, when I was at Gettysburg, I often kind of would say, you know, you have to be okay with certain things that we don't exactly know what happened. You can't just like die on the hill saying that this is what happened. You know, so, and I don't mean there's a hole in the battle. I mean, we know Pickett's charge happened, but I mean, sometimes there are these little details people get all hung up on. But the advice I would give is ask more questions and inquiry, and don't just look for things you agree for. If all the historical evidence you're looking for agrees with what you already believe, you're probably doing something wrong. So I think that's how I would approach things. I would also try to read history that is, I don't know how to say this nicely, but generally not written by non-historians, because I find that it often is overly simplistic. It's not, again, there are exceptions, but very frequently I find that there are these simple narratives that pop up out there. So I think that looking at evidence-based footnotes, and or even if it's a simple article, but multiple from someone who studied history really matters, because it's very easy to take a piece of evidence and look at it out of context if you don't know what the world is like in that era. You'll attach the assumptions from your current era into that, but it doesn't necessarily mean what you think it does if you look at that era. So I think that's the what I would say. But the biggest thing for your question for dissonance in our own head is, if everything you're seeing agrees with you, you're doing something wrong. That's what I would say from the historical side. All right, let's see another question here. What about things that are named after donors, their only relationship being through the money plaques? That is happening in Vermont nowadays. Understood. Now, I'd have to see a specific example, because like the monuments question, I don't have one answer that's always going to apply to everything. I'm guessing maybe you mean in colleges and things like that. That's pretty common. I would classify that a little bit differently than historical monumentation and historical representations. It's more like a sponsorship, if that makes sense. You could argue that, in 2 generations, like, do people look at that and kind of, how do they see that? I'm not sure, but I don't think my questions apply there, because we don't have the sequence of the significance and the history to remember and what does it mean to remember, etc. Unless, of course, you want to get into some of the politics of some of the donors, which sometimes could apply. And that's for each individual community to decide, right? But I'd have to see a specific case study to really kind of go more detailed into it. So if monuments are removed, where should they be put? Well, again, it depends on the circumstance. I mean, it depends on what we're removing. It's one thing to remove a lost cause monument versus a general Civil War monument versus a monument to MLK versus a monument to George Washington. They're all a little bit different kind of stakeholders and communities that you have. Of course, we had the colonialism thing come up twice in New Mexico I was describing, and of course, the monument with the Champlain. So it depends on the answer. I mean, are we talking about public property, private property? I mean, that also matters. Is it in the educational context? Is it not? Those also matter. I'll give you a quick example. I mean, when the Confederate battle flag went up in 1963 on the Alabama State Monument, state Capitol, George Wallace was very clear on why he put it up. So they're like, in that case, there's no question. Like, some people say, well, it's heritage, and it can be. I have room for that interpretation. But when the guy who puts it up and says, this is why I'm putting it up, then we know what the context of that symbol means. So you have to look at the context. That's what matters. And in that situation, I would say, well, maybe that's not the best place to put it on the state capitol, because, I mean, the guy who put it up told you this is why I'm putting it up. And it was probably not something we want to uphold. I mean, it wasn't something that was just doing as a random heritage thing. But in other situations, like in a museum setting, or when I was putting it up in my lecture, I think that's appropriate to have that there. And there are other situations I can get into. So it just depends on the circumstance. as to what the right answer is for each monument, and also the interpretation around it. What kind of signage is around there? How is it being used educationally or not? Are we just accepting that one perspective as a be-all end-all? Because there is no one perspective that's depicted by an artist and the group that funded the artist that is going to be fully accurate. I don't care who it's about. History is just not one-sided that way. How can we help our young students be more discriminating when they see a monument? That's a great question. And maybe the answer to that is interpretation, and what we call historical interpretation is sort of, helping them see the different layers, right? So here's where I would say the history of the monument itself matters. We often say the monument is history, and I don't think so. Monument is a depiction of history. And the way now you get into the history of the monument is you go, and this is something I find missing in the monument debates way too often. I think, and you say, well, there's some kind of committee or something was behind the monument coming up. It doesn't just spring up. You can find almost every time primary source material that says exactly what the committee is trying to do with this monument. That's where I would look to first, because that's going to tell you what they're trying to achieve with the monument. And if you pull together a few of those different stories, whether it's the Southern Lost Cause ones or the Northern Union Soldier ones, or forget Civil War, some other ones that you want to talk about, then what happens is you start to see, there's an array of different agendas here, perspectives here. And I think that complexity helps people say, maybe I need to be discriminating before I jump and project what I see on the monument as the meaning, because that's what we saw with the Champlain, right? Look how everyone had a different interpretation of the same monument, because it's what I see in the monument, not what the primary source material.
Question did come in. What do we do about Columbus?
Are we talking about the story, a monument? I'd like to know more if they're still around, if they want to kind of clarify.
This is from Leland. Leland, if you want to put into the chat or into Q&A.
I see their name is still up.
Yeah, why don't we assume if there's Columbus, with the Columbus statues that are still present. I know, for instance, in Barcelona, different country, but there's big central center of a circle there. There's a Columbus statue, and in other places as well. What are your thoughts about that, given the rethinking of the role of Columbus in this country's founding?
Yeah, the country's perspective matters, right? Because different countries are going to have different perspectives for that. But I would almost kind of think of it almost like I applied my questions to the monuments. I'd like to sort of step back to understand first before I'm like judging as a hero or villain. I think in history we could do better by not going into heroes and villains all the time, because we're always looking for these heroes and villains, right? And people don't easily fit into the hero and villain category. We do that, I feel like, in celebrities too, and Columbus is a sort of celebrity, historical celebrity, you know what I mean? So I think that we have these sometimes easy caricatures. So what do we do about Columbus? He's certainly significant. I know some of the stories change. I know he wasn't the first European here and it's not. That's fine, but it still is significant, first or not. I actually hate a lot of the first claims, because that's a whole different thing. It's like we tend to try to trace backward to see what the first this and that was, and I think those are often tenuous. But the first isn't what makes it significant. What does make Columbus significant, whether you like him or not, hero and villain aside, is that after his voyage, there's this huge era that ushers in, right? That changes the global map. And that part matters. And in that sense, Columbus is very much worth studying. But if you're talking about monumentation, I'd say it depends on the context of what's going on, right? If Spain or Italy are celebrating that, that he expanded the empire, that's a little bit different. And I mean, you and I may not like that, but it's their right to do that. You know what I mean? It's not something for us to say. In the US, I think it's a little bit different. Of course, he never actually came to the US. The US didn't even exist back then, but he never even really came to what is later the US. So it's really kind of a Caribbean story, which is another thing that gets lost in all this, I think. We kind of think very US centric in that regard. And we think looking backward, Columbus is not coming here to establish the US. There is no US, right? We have to really understand that. But, I would say that it speaks to a larger narrative, which actually, I'm starting a class next week, which is free, to one of the other humanities councils I could share with you, where we get into some of this. But I think it speaks to a larger narrative, if I could just say this for a moment, that we have this notion of condensed time from about, you know, the 1490s to, you know, to George Washington, the 1770s. So we condense about 300 years of this notion of, you know, Columbus arrives, European powers, American Indians, poof, gone. And that's not quite true. American Indians are A, all kinds of different groups. B, they have agency and they're doing negotiations and diplomacy themselves. These are people that are actively, you know, often sometimes resisting, sometimes doing alliances with Europeans. Even the Champlain, he did bad things to some indigenous people, but he also had alliances with some of them and protected them. And in fact, even adopted kids that were from the local American Indian groups. So, you know, these things are always complicated. And I don't see Columbus necessarily as a particularly evil toward indigenous populations, more so than anyone else. I think there are other people that you could point to that do a lot more, but he's sort of a symbol because we can't really name anyone else in our minds, you know, so because he's a celebrity. So again, like very mixed, and it depends on what the monument is trying to say. If the monument is saying, here's where he landed and changed all of world history, I'm more open to that. If the monument is saying, you know, he was some kind of god, then I'd be like, I'm not so sure about that. You know what I'm saying? So the heroes and villains thing is going to affect how I approach that in terms of the monument. But in terms of the story, I think we need to have a more complex story. And most early American historians would tell you that you have to understand that the colonial era in the Americas is a dynamic period with all kinds of different groups that are fighting for power and allying and fighting each other. Alliances shift all the time. And American Indian groups are a part of that, and they're actively doing this as well because they're fully human as well. Unlike our narrative, which I think kind of portrays them as passive victims that just sat there and, you know, took what the Europeans gave them, which is not a fair depiction.
Great.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yes.
Thank you, Raffi.
Guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.